Hello, and welcome to the EUROPAST Podcast. This podcast is part of the international project EUROPAST, funded from the Horizon Europe Widera program. EUROPAST tackles contemporary issues in memory studies, memory politics, political discourse, and most importantly, public history, a field of study and practice that explores the ways in which the production of knowledge about history can be rendered more democratic, open, collaborative, and empowering, as well as the challenges associated with this process. In this podcast, members of the project team talk to public history practitioners, researchers, historians, activists, filmmakers, and many others about the developments, challenges, and implications of this fascinating approach of dealing with the past. If you would like to know more about the project, follow EUROPAST on Facebook and Twitter. We hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Welcome to another episode of EUROPAST Podcast. We're in Vilnius University, and there are four of us today. Thomas Cauvin is an associate professor of public history at the University of Luxembourg and head of public history and outreach research area at the Luxembourg Centre for Contemporary and Digital History. He has been the president of the International Federation for Public History since 2018 and is the author of a foundational work in the field entitled Public History, a Textbook of Practice, published in 2016. Rūta Vyšniauskaitė is a member of EUROPAST team. She is a project administrator and a researcher. And Giorgio Ruggeri is also a member of EUROPAST team. He is a historian and a filmmaker and is a PhD candidate at the Lithuanian Institute of History. Welcome, everybody. Thomas, let me start with you. You know a lot about public history. So what is it?
Thank you, Violeta, and thank you for having me today here. Public history, for me, it's a process. It's a way of doing history. So it's not a topic in itself. It's more a way of doing history. I often define public history as a way of making history more public. So it can be making it more accessible to a large public, making it more participatory, so working with different publics, or applying history in the present. So overall, it's making history more public, more collaborative, more participatory, more open. So there's a lot of possible understanding, but I think this definition is wide enough so that people understand, oh, actually, I've been doing public history, or I'm interested in public history. So that's a definition that allows us to talk with many different people in very different parts of the world. So I think it's a definition that is wide enough and not too narrow, because the more you narrow the definition of public history, the more tensions you're going to have and more disagreements. So that's how I define public history.
May I ask you how you came to that field? Like, you are trained as a historian, correct?
This is correct, yes.
So what's your story, very briefly? How did you come to this area?
There are two answers. I remember the first time I heard public history. It was in 2009, and I was having a coffee in Italy, in Florence, where I did my PhD with a friend of mine, and I was explaining what my PhD research was, which was about the making of history in museums in Ireland and Northern Ireland. And my friend Serge Noiret told me that basically I was studying public history. I had no idea what public history was. So I started to learn more about it, and it started to resonate for two reasons. One is that before becoming a researcher, I was a teacher. And when you teach, you are way more in the engagement and the application of history than when you do research. So it sounded interesting to me. The second was I didn't want to spend 4 years of my life doing research for another book on the shelf, read by very few people. So I was trying to find more engagement and to make my research more alive, more useful. And again, public history resonated because it gave me tools and equipped me with skills to make history more public.
You yourself have a lot of transnational experience. You were born in France, you studied in Italy, you just talked about how you became interested in public history, that's in Italy. Then afterwards, you worked in the US. Now you're working in Luxembourg. In different countries, public history and its methods are understood differently, and these interpretations sometimes kind of clash with each other or are irritatingly different. So do you see this as kind of different way to very productive way to think about public history? Or is it a big challenge? How would you look at that?
Well, it's both a curse and an opportunity. A curse because, as you said, there are many different definitions, approaches of public history, and sometimes it takes time for people to share or agree on something they have in common, right? So that takes time. But it's better now than 15 years ago when there were way more misunderstanding or disagreement about what public history is or can be. But it's also an opportunity because people put something different in public, what public means. And when we talk with people in Japan, in Peru, in South Africa, in Kenya, in the US about their definitions of public history, sometimes they have, I wouldn't say little in common, but they have very different views of public history. Some people, especially in Europe, I would say, have a more theoretical understanding of public history, which is the traditional way that historians work. They study things, so they want to study public history as a topic, so they have a more theoretical understanding. Some other people, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries, have a more practical approach of public history. I do public history, and that's it. I don't have to define public history. We have some methodology, but I do public history first. And they also often have a joke about Europeans that think a lot about things, but in the end do very little about the productive aspect. And some Europeans criticize the North Americans for being too practical and too pragmatic and not thinking enough. Obviously, it's oversimplifying and it's in between. But we have different understanding of public history, and that's good. Right? The publicness of history changes and is different in different contexts. And we should not find and try to find a common definition of public history, but at least a framework of understanding. What's the publicness of history? Who's doing history? For whom? Where? Academic versus non-academic setting. So that is also an opportunity. I think the reason why public history is maybe booming more today than 10 or 15 years ago is the academic boom. Like more and more universities, and especially the administration, understand the benefit of public history because of the community engagement, the need for universities to connect more with their local, regional, national, international communities, and using and developing history that talks to people and engage to people. So I think the training, public history training, bachelor, master, PhD, as you know, is what makes public history more popular today.
I see. For those who perhaps just joined us, this is a EUROPAST podcast. My name is Violeta Davoliūtė. I am a leader of a EUROPAST project. And my next question goes to Giorgio. You have a lot of experience with public history. You are a filmmaker. You also have quite a bit of training. You got your master's degree in public history from the University of Milan.
And I developed some critical reflections
Absolutely.
about my experience. So, hi, Thomas. I wanted to ask you, we talked about these diverse interpretations of public history around the world. And of course, they are also reflected in different curricula of public history in several different universities around Europe and beyond. So I wanted to ask you if you can identify any good practices or any limits or weaknesses that you encountered, because you have quite large experience in dealing with different teaching methods and experiences in universities around the world. And also, if you see any challenges and opportunities for teaching public history in the future.
Thank you. Yes, many challenges. Well, one first challenge is, again, the definition of public history. People can put very different things behind public history. So it's important to define, not have a definition, but to define public history, because that forces us to situate ourselves. And sometimes public history is closer to memory studies. Sometimes it's closer to heritage production or audiovisual production. So we first have to define what we mean by public history. There are two main pillars in public history for me. One is to communicate history to non-academic public. So to make as an action history accessible, because it's an action, it's an act, it's a process. So it's communicating history, and most of historians, scholars, curators, they understand and they do that anyway. So it's a few skills to learn, but that's not that challenging. What is more challenging is working with different groups, with different partners, with people who have different objectives. When you have an historian working with a film producer or film director, they have different objectives. So how do you not reconcile, but that's not the point, but to collaborate with people who have different objectives? When you do a sort of citizen science version of public history, when you work with non-academic partners, participants, that's also very challenging, because people have different skills, different expectations, different understanding of the past. So there's a balance to have between people's interpretation of the past, which is very personal and very useful, but also the rigor of the historical methodology. So you have to combine this opening up the process of making science with people who may have different objectives and the rigor of the historical methodology. So that's something that has been constantly debated in public history. In citizen science, the quality control in citizen science is key. It's the same in public history. Not everything is public history. So there is an act of production that has to be combined with opening up the process with different parts. So that is very challenging.
I would just like to ask a question about that, because your idea about the quality control of citizen science is very interesting. How does one do that? How does it work, the quality control when it comes to working with the public and distinguishing between what is public history and what's not, perhaps?
Thank you, Rūta. There are two questions here, like who's doing the quality control and what quality control is. I usually prefer quality insurance than quality control, because behind control you have power and hierarchy. So the first thing is who's doing the quality insurance, and that can be collaborative too. I mean, we've been working, for example, about the history of Esch-sur-Alzette, which is the city where we live in Luxembourg. We've been working with Portuguese-speaking grandmothers to tell the history of the town. And the quality insurance was planned to be done with grandmothers. So the framework can still be the same, and we need to discuss the steps and how we do it, but it can be done collaboratively. And this is one step of the process that can be done with participants. Now, how you do the quality insurance or the decision-making depends on the project. Because participation has to be built, and you have multiple steps. Not everything has to be participatory. You can keep steps that are not participatory. You can have a radical citizen science in which everything is collaborative. So it really depends. And you have to think about public history for participation in terms of gains and losses, right? When you do participate with different people, partners, groups, associations, you gain things and you lose things. You lose independence, because you have to do compromises, you have to have a collaborative decision-making. You lose time because it's time-consuming. So you lose things. You have to be aware of what you lose, but you gain other things. Having people part of their history is also a gain. Having new sources instead of having only official archives, having oral history, having family pictures, having buildings as sources. This brings new levels of interpretation. So you gain things, you lose things, and you have to be aware of what you want to do. So that's what you need to discuss with your partners at the beginning, and that's also very challenging, especially when you go into training. And that's your first question about what's challenging in public history training, is that you have specific calendars for students, 3 months, and sometimes when you work with partners, the calendar is very different. Students are not used to working with non-academic partners. Students are not used to write script because students are trained to write academic essays. So when I ask my students to write a script for a podcast, they're lost because they want footnotes, right? And script, you don't have footnotes. So it's a challenge because it goes against the usual academic training and that we've been asking our students to do. That's one challenge that takes time to overcome.
I have maybe another question about teaching and training public historians. Usually, public history programs in universities or institutes are very holistic. They aim at providing students with a lot of different practical skills, ranging from filmmaking to podcasts, as you mentioned, or exhibition curating, and many, many other fields. But how deep can these skills be acquired by the students? How can they master all these fields?
They can't. You're right, and that's our mistake. By our mistake, I mean the faculty, because the field of public history is still new, and we want to do a lot of things. We want to change everything, but that's too fast, and we're asking too much to our students, because we're asking them to be good researchers, to go to the archives, to have the methodology, but on top of that, we're asking them to be good communicator, to be able to deliver their content not only by writing, but by speaking, by painting, by dancing, by producing films. And that's a lot. So usually public history courses are even more intensive because we ask maybe too much, certainly too much to our students. And there's a tension, you're right, there's a tension between trying to have this holistic or at least this generalist approach of doing public history and the fact that in 1 year, 2 years, you don't have time to become an archivist, right? So do we pretend that our students become public historians and archivists? I don't think that's true. We give them some tools to understand archivist, processes, and that's quite different. So the tension here in public history training is what do we want our students to become, and that's something that is not solved yet.
I have another question, not direct follow-up. Maybe then you will come back to the training aspect again. I wanted to ask, if public history is interpreted as communicating the past to strengthen democracy, is then public history possible in non-democratic societies?
It depends how you define public history. Propaganda can be a public history form, and we're just going to publish an article about public history practices under Franco Spain. You had alternative history by opponent to Franco who were doing public history practices. But, we could even argue that official history by, in dictatorship is a form of public history. It depends how you define history in that term, not the public aspect, but the history. Mm-hmm. So, the relation between public history and democracy is a very difficult but challenging question, and that's one of the key questions for EUROPAST. I think it connects for the definition of public. And I think one argument that I have not to work with some groups is that they don't accept the public aspect of history. They don't accept other interpretation of the past. So there was a question when I was working in the US about should we work with white supremacist groups about the history of monuments. So white supremacists are people who defend a very specific and we could say racist vision of America, right? So do we work with that type of group? It's a public, right? If we want to do participatory history, do we work with them when we want to discuss what to do with monuments, especially controversial monuments in the US? I decided with myself not to work with them, and that's a choice we need to explain, because those groups didn't accept other public interpretations of the past. So they had a very limited understanding of public and didn't want to work with other groups, which for me is a red line. If groups do not want to work with other part of the public, they have a very limited definition of public. And that's not something I want to develop. So the question about democracy and public history, I think public history helps to make history more representative, also of groups who have been absent of the official history. So there's a way here we could work together, and there's also a form of participation, because democracy is about participation. So whom is capable and allowed to work in the production of history? That's something that is key for public history, and that connects with democratic structures.
What does their perception of history bring open conflict? They have such conflicting perception of historical events. How can we then, how do we bring them together, and without crisis, so to say?
Crises are good. I mean, conflict is useful. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about agonistic memories and how conflict is actually useful in some ways, because by conflict you actually put together interpretation groups that would not talk if we don't have this project. So I don't think that conflict is necessarily bad. I mean,
I guess it depends on conflict, right?
And
if it's an armed conflict, so maybe it's.
And you cannot do participatory public history without conflict, because when you open participation, you have multiple interpretations. And that is what history is. We have different interpretation. We build interpretation. Conflict is key. So we should not. And there are different types of conflict, obviously. There are conflicts that accept the other or do not. So I would not say that we should avoid conflict or crisis, but we should create framework in which those different interpretation and conflicting interpretation talk to each other. And it's easier said than done, but we should not shy away from conflicting interpretations.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to? Okay.
So reflecting on what you said about working, not only communicating public history to the public, but working with the public and crises, and also maybe deciding not to work with certain publics, so to speak. What do you think is the role of public history in the current turbulent environment when we are experiencing very swift technological developments, long-term crises like migration developments, or even the climate crisis, as well as fast kind of burning crises like the pandemic? So in other words, can public history help to mitigate this turbulence?
Wow, that's a big question. And it's a good question, but that's not a question I like to answer. And I'm going to try to explain why. We have been supporting public history for a while now, and I don't want to pretend that public history is reinventing the wheel or has a magic wand. And that's a tendency that we may have. Oh, public history is new, it's so good, you should try. Public history is not an answer for conflict resolution. Public history is not an answer for climate change. Public history is just a form of doing history. So there are some limits. And I think the danger would be to pretend that public history can do things that it cannot. Having said that, one danger for history producers or knowledge producers is to shy away from public engagement. You have difficult discussions online, on social media, in the public, and you have two ways of reacting. Either you run away because those arguments are stupid, or and you shy away, you don't want to discuss, or you face those arguments and discussions. And public history gives some tools and skills for people, scholars and curators, and to be part of the public discussions and to be better equipped. For students to be better equipped to do social engagement on social media is key. So public history can give some tools and equip people with methodology and practices to occupy the public space. Then you use however you want, if it's for climate change, and there are connections between the past, history, and current discussion migration, climate change, politics. So you said. But there's not a magical way of doing public history to solve the world's problems.
And I would like to go back to the fact that public history is understood both as theory and practice. But when we talk about the practice of public history, public historians are not the only ones who do it in the public sphere. They are not the only ones who work with history with publics. I have in mind, artists, filmmakers, and politicians, for example. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the impact of public history, since it's probably also a way of historians to empower themselves in order to compete with those other actors, politicians, artists, and so on. And sorry for the long pause.
No, it's okay.
No, it gives me time to think about my answer. Well, my first answer would be that you don't necessarily need historians in public history. And that's something that I've been discussing with a lot of people. I don't really care if there are historians in public history. And I try not to use the term public historians. I prefer to use practitioner of public history, because what matters to me is the act of doing history, and you don't have to be historians to do history. Of course, there are some limits and challenges. Not everything is history, but history is a method. It's not an identity. So I prefer not to use the term public historians, but practitioners. And I completely think that there are public history practices without historians. So that's one thing that set up my way of thinking. And obviously, and that goes back to your question, public history is practiced by people who are not historians. Artists do public history. You have archivists who use archives in their work, and they present different understanding of archives. And I love to work with artists for the communication aspect, because historians, academic historians, professionals, are usually quite bad at dealing with feelings, expressions of the past, and visualizing the past. Artists are much better at there. That's one of their skills. And when historians can work with artists, sometimes you end up in fantastic projects in which you have the authenticity of the archives, the understanding of the past, but also this feeling, this connection with people who watch, who hear, who feel, who smell the past. And that gives new levels of communication, of history, that I really like. So, yeah, there are filmmakers. The debates have been always about to what extent films are authentic or not. I don't really care.
But what do you think about the risks of history being put in the public sphere in terms and through interpretations that are not necessarily good for society?
Yes, there are risks. But is your question about what should historians do, or the manipulation of history is something different?
The manipulation of history existed before the label public history was invented and will keep exist in the future. But my question was about what kind of impact do you think the public history community aims to have?
Mm-hmm. In that case, what the main impact could be is for public history to give tools to researchers or people who go to the archives to make their work available and accessible. Because it's not, we know that it's not because you're a good researcher that you are a good communicator. It's not because you're a good researcher that you're a good teacher. If you want to teach, you have to learn how to teach. So I think it's important that we become better communicator. And with that, we can make archives-based research, available and accessible in the public space. So that's one way of fighting the manipulation of history by, fact-based, archives-based research available to the public. So public history gives skills and equip people to do that, and to sometimes, if they want, to fight with other, interpretation or manipulation of history.
So finally, very simple question. Looking ahead, in your view, what are the biggest challenges for practitioners of public history today?
I would say one is the tension between opening up the field to non-professional, let's call it this way, people who are not trained in history. So if you want to open up the field and to make the field more participatory with people who have very different expertise, that's very challenging. So I think it's important that we build participation into steps and that we learn from other disciplines, because historians have been notoriously late in doing participation, late in communicating their work. So I think we need to learn more from other disciplines. And again, I think that citizen science is key in building steps for participation and acknowledging that people have different expertise. You don't have to be a trained historian to participate in public history. You can organize events, you can have your living expertise, you went through things. You have different way of participating in public history. So I think the tension for practitioners is to balance this opening up of the process without losing the fact that history is still a science, like creating knowledge based on archives. So this tension is important. And the second is the pressure on public history. And I think your question also meant that public history can solve everything or can revolutionize the field. And I think we need to be more humble about what we can achieve with public history, especially in terms of conflict, tension, political division. Public history is bringing some tools and equip people with some skills, but cannot answer the political divisions today.
So I think we could have a lot of questions, but we're running out of time. And so there is a lot of food for thought. So thank you very much. I would like to thank everyone, and let's continue the discussion.
Thank you, Violeta.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.